Hey guys, this is Ari, and I wanted to give this quick little intro / warning before we get into this episode. The warning is specifically because the topic of this conversation, and specifically the way Dr. Boros talks and teaches this subject, really kind of assumes a pretty strong familiarity with a lot of basic concepts in understanding human metabolism, physiology, biochemistry, and things of that nature. So the warning is basically, if you don't have a significant background in those subjects, this particular podcast might be difficult for you to understand. So I want to kind of save you some frustration. Maybe you want to skip it altogether, or just at least mentally prepare yourself for the fact that there's going to be things that Dr. Boros explains in many cases in this podcast that are over your head, and just kind of resolve to understand what you can understand and glean some insights without getting too frustrated over the fact that he's saying things that you can't understand. So with that said, I really want to encourage you to listen to it. This is a fascinating subject. There's lots of really great insights to glean from this. One more little thing I want to say is this is part 2 of this podcast with Dr. Boros, or the second podcast, I should say. So with that in mind, we're kind of assuming that you've already listened to part 1, you already understand a lot of the basic concepts we covered there, and then we're kind of picking up where we left off. So if you haven't already listened to part 1, I strongly encourage you to do that before you listen to this one, because again, it'll just be a source of frustration for you. You'll find this material pretty inaccessible unless you've already listened to all the material we covered in part 1. The last little thing I want to mention is he had some audio issues on his side. I spent probably 20 minutes with him trying to get these audio issues resolved. At the end of the day, we couldn't figure out what was causing this little clicking noise on the background on his end. And we decided, since we had this appointment scheduled and it was like kind of weeks in the making, we decided to just record anyway. So I apologize for the audio issues. If you just kind of, hopefully you can kind of block those out and just listen to the content. Again, this is really fascinating stuff, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hey there, this is Ari Whitten. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. Today, I have with me for the second time, Dr. Laszlo Boros. We are going to cover even more nuances and complexities of this whole topic of deuterium. Now, before we get into this, I want to preface by saying that I'm sure, even not having recorded this yet, I'm sure that today's podcast will be full of enough biochemistry complexities that if you have not already listened to the first podcast, you will probably be totally lost listening to this one. So make sure to listen to the first podcast before you listen to this one. It's a complex topic, and you'll need kind of that background information to get into this one. So with that said, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Boros. He is a professor of pediatrics at UCLA and the co-director of the Stable Isotope Research Laboratory at the Los Angeles Biomedical Research Institute at the Harbor UCLA Medical Center, with a primary focus on studying cancer cell metabolism. He's also an internationally proclaimed expert of metabolic water biochemistry, as well as the role of deuterium in health and disease. And this is just a snippet of his very long and impressive CV. But I wanted to, without getting into a long list of all that stuff, I wanted to give a kind of a quick snapshot of his expertise. So welcome back to the show, Dr. Boros. Such a pleasure to have you, and thank you for coming on for part 2.
Hello, and hello, everyone. And it's an honor to talk to your audience and to you about these complex issues. And I hope, after all, we can settle it so it's understandable for the audience.
Yes. Now, I'm going to try to give a super ultra brief summary of the basic idea of deuterium and why it matters in health. Please correct me if I say anything wrong or add anything that you think is essential. But basically, we have this compound called this molecule called deuterium, which is an isotope, a variant of hydrogen. Hydrogen, of course, if people think of like H2O, water,
Our bodies are 70% water, so we're filled with lots and lots of hydrogen. Well, some of those hydrogens, a very small portion of them, can be this variant called deuterium, which basically has this proton. It's basically like a very large, very heavy version of hydrogen. And when we accumulate this in our body and our cells in excessive amounts, and when our body systems for getting rid of it, for depleting it, are not functioning optimally, these deuterium molecules can end up working their way into our cells, into our mitochondria, where they can physically damage those mitochondria and cause them to be dysfunctional or die off. Is that sort of an accurate 30-second or minute-long summary of this whole concept?
This was actually very accurate. I just have to make two small corrections.
Okay.
Hydrogen and deuterium, these are atoms, not molecules.
Okay, thank you.
Atoms, we, by definition, atom is a single chemical entity. It is composed of protons, neutrons, as you mentioned, and electrons. So that's only just one little detail. And when you look at the mass difference between hydrogen and deuterium, it's actually 100% increase. So deuterium is twice as heavy, twice as large as protons or hydrogen atom mass. So it's the largest increase in weight and size as far as the atomic word goes, meaning that this is really a dramatic increase in portions of weight and size adding to any atom. I'll give you an example. If you look at carbon, which has 12 particles in the nuclei, 6 protons and 6 neutrons. If you look at the first stable isotope, it's C13, which has 1 extra neutron, but it only increases the weight by about 8%. So it's really not a 100% increase. So the other isotopes and atoms in our chemistry word are much less dramatic as far as exerting any kind of biological effect. This is deuterium is so important, but your summary was excellent. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for that. So we had some communications following the part 1 podcast, and I had been thinking about some issues, and there were some things that kind of weren't making a lot of sense to me. And then we started communicating about them, and you started basically saying, these are complex issues. We should just do a part 2 podcast and cover some of these complexities there because these aren't simple answers. So that's part of the impetus of this podcast. Now let's get into some specifics about deuterium. There's a whole bunch of complexities to the biochemistry here that I want to dig into. And a lot of this seems very focused on the biochemical mechanisms. What I'd like to ask you is to kind of zoom out to the big picture. What do we know about deuterium and human health for certain? So leaving sort of the biochemical mechanisms aside for now, as far as I can tell, the main research that we have is the use of deuterium depleted water in the context of people with cancer. And there's some really positive research there showing that it can benefit people with cancer and prevent progression of the cancers and so on. Outside of that, I've been able to find one study, maybe 2 studies, where they were, I think, in Bulgaria, looking at natural water concentrations of deuterium in the water supply and drawing a correlation between that and the health of those populations. But beyond that, I really haven't been able to find a whole lot of kind of big picture, long-term health outcomes as a result of deuterium levels. What do you perceive as the best evidence that we have for the role of deuterium in human health?
There's a very good paper from the University of Oxford looking at deuterium content in drinking water and comparing that to depression and anxiety susceptibility. And it is a map that almost correlates with the US deuterium content in water, meaning that it seems that there's almost a regression coefficient correlation, a very strong, very close correlation to the amount of drinking water, the deuterium in the amount of drinking water, and certain population diseases, including anxiety and depression. And also, if you compare this map with the US United States cancer mortality or death statistics, it's also very highly correlated, meaning that if you explore published data in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, clinical data that shows disease prevalence and that are mostly population diseases that includes obesity, cancer, and anxiety and depression, there's a very high correlation of deuterium content of drinking water. And I don't know if you saw that paper, I can send you a copy of it, but practically that's one of the very crucial, very important papers that we usually review simply just for additional information and looking at the deuterium content of the water that they publish, which is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Geology. They actually measured these values. Mm-hmm. And the other very important development is that now there is a new study out from the University of Basel Children's Hospital, where they actually link cancer treatments with mechanisms that deplete deuterium by closing active porins on the cell surface, or actually making potable extracellular or environmental water to be able to enter the mitochondria or the cells, therapeutically very beneficial. And they discuss deuterium, the role of deuterium in these papers. And these are clinical papers. These are patient-related data, case reports, and small cohorts that we can actually trace now from the deuterium biochemistry point of view. And these treatments do the same as what biochemistry arguments or biochemical reactions do. Usually when you perform a biochemical reaction, you always use water or protons of water or hydroxyl groups of water. That's the most common biochemical reaction. We call it hydrolysis, when the enzyme uses a water molecule to actually break a substrate into products or modify the product. Now, because hydrogen is involved in these biochemical reactions, the twice as heavy deuterium counterpart does not work well with these reactions. And some of those reactions are designed by nature to remove hydrogen and replace it with cellular water-derived hydrogen. And that's supposed to be deuterium depleted simply because our cells and membranes are trying to keep deuterium out, and they try to deplete deuterium for the protection of mitochondria.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So we have some epidemiological evidence, as you said, from the water supply and how that correlates with rates of anxiety, depression, and cancer risk. Mm-hmm. We have the randomized controlled studies with deuterium depleted mm-hmm. water in the context of cancer patients. Mm-hmm. And we have the layers of evidence that you presented here. So are there people now working on like randomized controlled studies with healthy population and things of that nature to look at long-term risk of various diseases?
I do get feedback from my colleagues who actually deliver deuterium depleting therapies. There's one clinician, her name is Dr. Dorfser, and she reports back of her patients, not necessarily just cancer and anxiety, but also there are cases which she can discuss with you. But it's very, if you wish, but it's very broad as far as from feedback from physicians, practicing physicians or naturopathic medicine clinics, that deuterium depletion has not only cancer and not only diabetes or obesity, but some other neurodegenerative positioning or being able to have patients in many disease areas with deuterium depletion. At UCLA, we are running preclinical studies with deuterium depleted water in neonatal complications, meaning that when there are low birth weight babies, their lungs are, because of the ventilation and because of the positive pressure breathing machines, their lungs get damaged. And those cells actually are very well protected by deuterium depleted water, simply because their nanomotors are protected by deuterium depleted water. there are randomized clinical studies, as you mentioned, which are open access studies. So in prostate cancer, definitely there is one, and there's one in there are case reports in brain cancer. You can actually look at those papers in the scientific literature, and there are some correlative or some epidemiological studies, the one that we mentioned before and the one that you mentioned from Bulgaria. Those can be used on a broader scale of arguments of how deuterium depletion helps, after all, of our health. And obviously, there is a clinical scenario or clinical approach where actually they look at various plasma profiles, for example, lipid profiles, and what they find is, it's again a clinical study from Pittsburgh, that if a patient has high circulating fatty acid levels, their cancer progresses less rapidly, simply because of the lower deuterium content of fatty acids that are available for making metabolic water in tumor cells as well. And those papers, in their discussions, they actually bring up deuterium depletion as the potential biochemical mechanism for the better outcome for those patients. And I have a list of those papers that people can find on my website. I encourage everybody to do research, literature research, or PubMed science research on deuterium depletion.
Well, I'd like to get some of those references from you, and we'll put them on the podcast pages for these two podcasts with you on my website. So that'll be at theenergyblueprint.com/deuterium. So I'll make sure to get some of those references that you're referring to. Are there any studies where they've looked at tissue levels of deuterium in specific diseases other than cancer? So like in diabetes, for example, or neurological diseases, have they found that people with those diseases have higher levels of deuterium accumulated in the pathological tissues?
Actually, MRI is a deuterium measuring device. So any study that used low energy field MRI can be used for this purpose. Right. It's very hard to measure deuterium tissue levels simply because you have to have biopsies and so on if you want to do it directly. But indirectly,
or even whole body deuterium in people with various diseases.
There is deuterium metabolic profiling now carried out by the Yale University. And what we see is that once they label glucose, for example, with deuterium, that shows up in metabolic water very quickly. So you can actually load deuterium into your tissues, and that's a radiology type of work. And I can give you that reference as well. But practically, all the studies, when it comes to reinterpretation of data, all these studies could be performed if there was a significant interest in studying tissue levels of deuterium in connection with various diseases. I don't really know about any clinical studies that actually look at these, but if we do our own work with collaboration or just following up on publications, for example, of the Yale University Department of Radiology, we can find a lot of useful data to address these particular questions or concerns. But looking at MRI data and looking at MRI measurements, it seems that deuterium tissue concentration in connection with plasma and blood deuterium content based on the density of these MRI images, there can be a very useful way or approach to actually address these very important questions.
Yeah. Let me ask one more kind of layer to this question, which is, in the last episode, we talked about some of the deuterium tests that are available. So urine and saliva and so on, and breath. You mentioned some specific numbers that I think, forgive me if I'm getting these slightly wrong, but I remember you mentioning like wanting to see below 130 or 125 parts per million on the breath test or the saliva test. And then we talked about a difference in measurement from the urine to the breath or from the saliva to the breath.
Mm-hmm.
I'm forgetting which one it
Mm-hmm.
was, but
Mm-hmm.
my question to you is, don't those numbers have to be based on something? Like, don't they have to be based on, you know, that, like, we know that healthy populations have these levels of deuterium and diseased populations have these levels of deuterium. So therefore we want to see it at these levels, which is associated with good health.
Yeah, it depends on age group and it depends on health. Uh, uh, Patients, and I don't want to sound like we are running a clinical study, but let's talk about my own data. My breath BPM is 137 without depleting deuterium. My saliva and urine in the same time, it's 146. So our body is trying to deplete deuterium, and we can measure it. It's not a question of our breath, which is our more like tissue imprint water in our exhaled breath. It has lower deuterium. I believe, and this is a biological context, that our biological system developed. Again, we look at historically the deuterium content in water and air. Historically, an anthropology evaluation of those values go back 15, 20,000 years, or even 4 million years in some scenarios based on the nutritional inputs of those papers, that we can tell that actually the evolution of mankind was actually a deuterium depleted environment for a very long time, eating ketogenic food, bone marrow more specifically, fat and bone marrow and brain, or tissues that could be obtained from bones. So practically our metabolism, our deuterium processing biological ability, our biochemical threshold and protection from deuterium from the environment, it is scaled somewhere in the 125 to 140 range in the last 15,000 years. That was the last type of measurements that we could actually bring from the scientific literature. After that, there's climate change, there is food processing, there's a lot of chemical processes that actually load deuterium into our environment and into water and into food.
Lowered deuterium in the environment?
It's actually loads. So
Okay.
it's actually decumulation and it's just increased now in food and environment, deuterium, and we believe that it exceeds our biological threshold, and mitochondria are exposed to deuterium now more and more in the population, and because of that, there's more population diseases and there's more epidemics of more obvious epidemics of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, or obesity, diabetes, and you know what in large scale those trends are. And they are almost the same or very similar to how deuterium increased in our food and in our environment by processed foods and also with bottled water.
Yeah.
So these are
there. I feel like there's. Forgive me for interrupting you, but there's so many layers there that I want to dig into. First, I will say, just, you know, to play devil's advocate, yes, you could draw those kind of correlations that, you know, over the last, let's say, 100 years, deuterium levels have raised, but it's also the case that processed food is a major driver of disease for reasons that really don't relate to deuterium. I mean, deuterium may be part of that story, but we also know there's other mechanisms at play, certainly, as far as damaging gut health and gut microbiome, causing chronic inflammation, and causing, you know, the whole food reward theory of obesity, causing chronic overconsumption of food, leading to fat gain, diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity, and all of the diseases that are associated with that. So there's many mechanisms at play. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so again, deuterium content in your food will determine how your gut bacteria is able to proliferate and how much deuterium gets into your epithelial cells of your gut. So after all, gut starts processing deuterium from food, and that's one of the main purpose of gut bacteria, to actually harvest deuterium from food or any substrate that gets into your digestive system, because that's how bacteria grow. They retain deuterium. And if deuterium is excessive in processed food, which is the case, we know that because of data and because of arguments in clinical translational science, that can damage your epithelial cells of your gut. So, and you're right. Those are very critical, very crucial. The leaking gut syndrome is very crucial, very important. But again, it has a biochemical mechanism or a biochemical reasoning that goes back to your deuterium in your food that is exposing your epithelial cells for mitochondrial damage.
Okay. So,
Mhm.
on an environmental level, outside of the processing of the food supply, and I wouldn't try to debate you that the deuterium content of the food supply has increased as a result of processed food. I think that's unquestionably true. But on a sort of more historical environmental level, you were mentioning something to the effect of that deuterium is increasing in the overall environment. So can you be specific? So, like, let's say over the last 10 million years, has there been any noticeable shift in the amount of deuterium, like in the general water supply, for example, or in the air that we're breathing?
Yeah, this is a very good question. If you go back to 12 to 15,000 years and you look at volcanic ash that erupted in New Zealand, where there is actually ocean vapor. It's a small island enough to be covered with ocean vapor, and the volcanic ash would actually capture the deuterium content of the ocean vapor, and it's about 135 ppm. So it's actually significantly lower in the was 12 15,000 years ago than it is now as far as oceanic vapor goes. Now, oceanic vapor determines of your rains deuterium level, and because of falling rains deuterium level determines your crops deuterium level. This is kind of more like a circle of deuterium in the environment that actually eventually gets into all kind of food sources and all kind of physical process, simply because of the evaporation of the ocean is now occurring at a higher temperature. And again, because of the physical processes involved in deuterium exposure and deuterium fractionation and deuterium loading into the environment, we can actually trace historically these processes through data in physics and geology, simply because this is why this is an interdisciplinary, or this is an approach where actually you have to consider many different areas when you formulate your opinion. The other interesting thing is that in anthropology's data and studies in anthropology, we now learn that the human brain developed on ketogenic diet simply because the prehistoric man was only eating or had access to significant amounts of bone marrow, because they could open by tools, they could open the long bones of plant-eating animals. And that fat source is about 118 to 112 ppm, meaning that actually...
How many ppm is it?
118, between
18.
112
okay, I thought you
and
said 180.
118.
Yeah, okay, good.
So it's significantly lower than the food that we eat. If you buy a corn chip and you eat like a bag of chips, then you are eating 156 ppm fructose enriched corn chips, which are actually very high in deuterium. Our ancestors did not have this high deuterium source simply because they didn't have access to much fruit, and they didn't have access to...
Let me dig into that with you a bit. So you're saying that our ancestors ate mostly bone marrow specifically?
That's what the anthropology data shows. It was a non-competitive food source because predators left the bones behind. So the prehistoric man was able to open skulls and also long bones of like femur of, for example, a mammoth. And that yielded a lot of bone. It was a non-competitive food source for them. And in fact, in
You're saying
400,000,
like they're scavenging the kills of other predators, like a lion kills a zebra, and then the humans are going into the carcass and eating the bone marrow.
eating the bone marrow because they could open it by tools, by stone
Whereas the
tools,
animals couldn't.
whereas the animals couldn't. And this is because we can use our fingers now. We can oppose our fingers, so simply we can hold tools and we can actually use stones to break bones. This is anthropology. This was published by the University of Arizona, and we're gonna put these papers together for this podcast, so you can actually go back to the original scientific data.
Yeah.
They depended on bone marrow so much that they learned how to make conserve, or how to make a pantry of it. Now I'm just using the terminology that they use in the original publication. But what they did, once they found a carcass, and if they could not eat the bone marrow because they were not hungry, for example, what they did is they actually pulled back the skin onto the bone, which had the bone marrow for later use. So they could, based on the historic and anthropology data, 400,000 years ago, cavemen was actually pickling their own bone marrow by simply pulling the bone and suturing the skin back on the bone that they found, and they were able to conserve bone marrow for up to 9 weeks, meaning that for almost 2 months they could actually keep this bone marrow around. If they were hungry, they could actually carry them with them. So these conserved bones. So if you look at anthropology data, if you look at historic data, what you learn is that our nutrition was a very deuterium depleting nutrition. Our environment was, go ahead.
Let me just play devil's advocate for a moment. So this is maybe one period in history that you're referring to as far as our ancestors. I think there's two, I want to kind of sandwich that period in history with our ancestors on either side of it. Going back way further than that, we could look at our primate ancestors who were mostly, at least by modern primates, mostly vegetarians and plant eating, or herbivorous, maybe with some exceptions. I think chimpanzees and maybe a few other primates have some carnivory aspect of what they're doing, but or they're meat eating sometimes, but they're mostly herbivorous. And then more recent to that, the best data we have on hunter-gatherers from anthropology researchers like Stefan Lindeberg, who wrote a book compiling all this data from his studies of hunter-gatherers that are still in existence today. There are many tribes, the Hadza, the Tukisenta, the Tarahumara, the Simane, the Kuna, who are eating actually carbohydrate-based diets. So it does seem to me that going back many thousands of years ago, for a large chunk of human history, this carbohydrates have been a big part of our diet. I mean, I just don't think it's a reasonable argument to say that we were eating predominantly fat, like all of our human ancestors were eating predominantly fat.
This is what I thought actually would be the case, but it seems that once they found how to open the bones, once the human evolution started based on this nutritional adaptation, that's when the human being started to develop. And you're right, primates who are vegetarians, they are still in that same, I would say, developmental stage, but the humans, simply by finding this food source, the deuterium depleted food source, they were able to advance in their brain development simply because they were eating less deuterium loaded food. Now, again, you're right, the primates are vegetarians. I mean, most of the primates. Chimpanzees are actually carnivores, so they feed on, actually they are so carnivores that they can actually kill other species, almost like eradicate other faunas and species. There was some stories in an African journal, but you're right. If you eat a plant-based diet, if it's not a processed food, then the carbohydrates in plants, beans, and many plants, especially in seeds, which are high in fat, those are also deuterium depleted. So it is deuterium depletion after all. What food sources is, you just have to find exactly what is the origin of that food, deuterium depleted food. Simply, nature has carbohydrates depleted of deuterium, fatty acids depleted of deuterium. This is one of the extra chloroplasts or extra mitochondrial synthesis of certain sugars or carbohydrates in plants. So they are actually very deuterium depleted on certain positions. So when you talk about these nutritional scenarios, those also fit in to the deuterium depletion scenario, and you just need to identify exactly, and you need to look at the original data, how depleted those are, but actually we can link those mechanisms to deuterium depletion as well.
Gotcha. Okay, so man, I have so much on my list here to cover. You've mentioned, for example, like that refined flour and sugar, and you gave the example of like corn chips covered in vegetable oil, that those would be also very high in deuterium, like 165 parts per million. It seems to me 156.
56, yeah.
Now, isn't it from what I looked at, and correct me if my numbers are slightly off here, but from what I saw, most water sources, typical like tap water, is around 150 or 145. It's not that far off from that.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And as I was thinking about it after our first podcast, and I had emailed you this as kind of what prompted this whole discussion of doing the second podcast, but it occurred to me that when we're looking at these parts per million numbers of, let's say, refined sugar, and let's say someone consumes 5 tablespoons of pure refined sugar every day, and you can look at the parts per million and say, oh, it's 155 parts per million of deuterium. But then you can sort of compare that to, let's say, 145 parts per million of water. But then when you figure in the absolute amounts of grams of the substances that we're consuming, so let's say it's 5 tablespoons of sugar over here, whatever that works out to be, 70 grams of carbohydrate at 155 parts per million. So let's say it's, I don't know, whatever the math works out to be, 1,000, however many thousands of deuterium atoms. But then if you consider that you compare it to just plain water consumption at 145 parts per million, slightly lower, but instead of 70 grams of that substance, you're consuming 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 grams a day. So the actual amount of deuterium atoms that is being poured into the body each day is 10 times, 50 times greater just from drinking plain water than it is from any particular food source. So my question to you is, if you're gonna look at specific foods and kind of look at their toxicity in that regard, wouldn't this model, this way of looking at things, mean that plain old water consumption is like the most toxic thing of all, because that's adding the most deuterium atoms to the body?
You're right in that argument, and this is actually a very interesting new area of studying, simply because if you drink water excessively, meaning that you don't be athirst, you just kind of drink it as a habit, you turn or downregulate or dismantle the process that we call antidiuretic hormone synthesis, which actually helps mitochondrial health very much. And our urine production, you actually use about 800 liters, which probably is about 200 gallons of primary filtrate in your kidneys a day, and it's reabsorbed into the circulation through the kidney tubules, and those are deuterium depleting processes. But actually, there is a threshold that you cannot really exceed as far as loading deuterium in your system. And once you exceed these thresholds, there's even a worse thing that happens. Let's say, I give you an example. Let's say your biochemistry or biochemical reactions can filter out 140 ppm from water into urine. I'm just giving you an example. 140 ppm water is, or 130 ppm water is when that makes sure there's no, if you drink it moderately or when you're thirsty, then there's no deuterium that gets into your mitochondria. If you drink 140 ppm water excessively, you actually increase your deuterium dramatically simply because not only your scavenging mechanism is failing, but practically the amount, if you multiply with the deuterium content of the water that you're drinking, you're actually exceeding biological threshold or filtering processes very, very dramatically. And that can be, as you mentioned very accurately, that's a very good argument, that can actually cause mitochondrial damage. And in tissue-specific mitochondrial damage scenarios, you can develop diseases which obesity, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, these neurodegenerative diseases. Those are all part of this process, simply trying to fight off deuterium that is arriving from water, mostly because excessively drinking water has one of those bad side effects.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
So now this is where the whole landscape gets really muddled to me, because on the one hand, there are many health experts out there recommending for you to drink more water and noticing beneficial effects of drinking more water. There are many studies that have shown that have linked, for example, low consumption of water with a mild state of dehydration, impaired brain performance, impaired mood, increased risk of various diseases. And I've seen studies, I can cite studies on the podcast page related to that for anybody interested. And even more directly to this, there are other people talking about deuterium and deuterium's role in health, who have the opposite advice as you have. They have, for example, Jack Kruse. So he's also talking about the importance of keeping deuterium levels low, but he's a huge advocate of drinking lots and lots of water. You're saying that we should keep deuterium levels low, but we have to, in order to do that, we need to be careful with our water consumption and not drink too much. It seems to me that one of you guys has to be wrong in this story, and I don't know which one it is, but it just, something doesn't make sense here.
So is this about water consumption, or this is about deuterium? I think we agree on deuterium somewhat.
Yeah, you and Jack Kruse agree on deuterium, but you have totally opposite recommendations with regards to water consumption.
Okay, so my argument is practically just like anything else, your body has the ability to control urination and water intake and food intake. That's why hunger, that's why thirst, that's why these hormones are established or are actually working in our physiology to actually control these processes. I don't see any reason to drink water if you are not thirsty. Your thirst is there to show you or signal to you that you have to drink water. I'll give you an example. You only see animals drinking when they are thirsty.
Yeah.
The lions, they are actually laying close to the lake for hours simply because they just digesting their food. They only drink when they are thirsty. And I have not seen any other species, both from consuming water excessively without any cause or any reason, or having diseases, population diseases, the amount or the scales and the nature of what we have now as human populations. And truly, water is a very precious resource, obviously, even if even if it's not available, the drinking or the consumption of water is regulated just like urination, meaning that you do it in certain periods when you have a need for it. And antidiuretic or ADH is very important because with excessive water intake, you can actually shut down its production. I'll give you an example. In the American population now, the average ADH serum level is about 0.6. The normal level would be 1, meaning that actually the general American population is actually suffering from a disease called diabetes insipidus when you don't have enough antidiuretic hormone to regulate your water intake and your urination. So if you drink excessive amount of water, you urinate excessive amounts of water, and simply this is not what nature invented for you. This is not why your thirst is based on antidiuretic hormone levels, is signaling to you when you do need to drink water, and even it tells you how much water you should drink, because your thirst goes away once you have consumed enough amount of water. Usually animals, let's say predators, they only go once or twice to drink, simply because for them it's very dangerous, because that's where predators gather. Water consumption, because you are actually exposed to an open area, it's usually a group activity of animals. So water consumption is, and they don't have bottled water. So just because humans have bottled water and it's not a challenge to consume it anymore, it does not mean that you should consume it, simply because it has some effects which are undesirable from the endocrinology point of view. And if you look at this data, what's the average antidiuretic hormone level in the American population, you're going to see that actually it's in the disease range almost. So it's like a diabetes insipidus in a large scale. And
but
that's true of,
to be fair, isn't antidiuretic hormone affected by more than just water consumption? I mean, I think it has to be, because so I think there's a lot of legitimacy to what you're saying, but here's how I would break this down. Like, yes, it is genuinely the case that it is possible to have excessive water consumption and harm to health. You can cause hyponatremia. There are athletes that die from hyponatremia as a result of excessive water consumption. It's the case that if someone consumes, 2 or 3 gallons of water, plain water right now in the next 5 minutes, they can cause permanent brain damage and put themselves in a coma or even die from drinking too much water. It is also the case, though, that there's research showing that low levels of water consumption is linked with increased risk of disease. And while I agree that it's definitely something that's regulated, there are studies that have shown impaired athletic performance, impaired energy levels, impaired mood, impaired cognitive performance, measurable levels of impaired performance on those areas before the person actually feels thirst. So there seems to be this kind of area that someone can be slightly dehydrated before feeling thirsty. And I mean, I think it's a complex area.
So again, if you drink water excessively, then you, just like you kill your beta cells to produce insulin, you can kill your hypothalamic cells to produce antidiuretic hormone. It takes about 6 months to build the ability to produce antidiuretic hormone again, which again has a very strong and very important effect on mitochondrial functions. If you run a study on someone who does not have yet the ADH to be adjusted to participate and respond to water withdrawal appropriately, then you're going to have these side effects. And I agree with you. If you select your disease or study population carefully, meaning that you actually primed these patients or these subjects to be able to produce ADH, then even with low water intake, you're not going to see these negative effects, simply because your body knows how to regulate sodium, potassium, and other salts in your and atoms and inorganic chemical substitutes in your plasma, simply because that's one of the other roles that ADH or antidiuretic hormone and other hormones do. So you have to, it's pretty much like giving sugar to a patient who has not built the ability to produce insulin. So you don't cut water intake in patients who don't know how to produce or don't have the ability to produce antidiuretic hormones. If you prime them with gradually lowering their water intake, and you actually prime them to be able to produce ADH, in those studies, you would get a very different outcome.
Gotcha. One of the other areas that I was thinking about after our first podcast is, so you were kind of talking about avoiding excessive water consumption. I think you mentioned something to the effect of you don't drink water either at all, or you drink very small amounts of it, and you drink mostly olive oil, based on that the fat will be produced into metabolic water by your mitochondria. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. I do drink water when I'm thirsty.
Okay.
And I do drink water. I follow nature's rules. If I had enough fat, and if I don't exercise, if I don't walk the dogs, if I don't do my push-ups, if I don't challenge myself with physical exercise, then there are days that I don't have to consume water simply because I had or eaten enough fat or had enough oil in my system that produces metabolic water. If I'm thirsty, the first thing I do is just to drink a small amount of water that kills my thirst, because that's what my body signals to me, that my ADH hormone signals to be some other in correlation with other hormones. It just signals to me that you need to drink water. And I would certainly drink deuterium depleted water because that's what our body is trying to produce. And the amount is practically a half a glass, simply just to see how much of that water kills my thirst.
Yeah.
So,
but aren't water molecules required for beta oxidation, for using fats for fuel? Don't we have a net loss of water through the course of the day, and even as a result of consuming food, unless you're consuming really water-rich food? Isn't it still a net loss even if the water that is being produced is deuterium depleted metabolic water?
Yes, so let me answer your first question first, because in the mitochondria, in the tricarboxylic acid cycle, we all constantly recycle water. That's what the fumarate hydratase, that's what citrate synthase, that's what isocitrate dehydrogenase does. They actually recycle water in the mitochondria. So your metabolic water, 7,200 liters of it or 2,000 gallons of it a day, that amount of water protons are recycled in the mitochondria. And in mitochondria, there's another process that is occurring, and this is actually entering this scientific argument and field very rapidly, is what we call is the quantum destabilization of protons or water. And this is practically how you're in the mitochondrial nanoconfinements or very tiny spaces in the mitochondrial cristae or cris. There is actually a spontaneous water between those hydrophobic membranes. There's a spontaneous disassembly of water into hydrogen, protons, and hydroxyl groups. And the protons tend to go through this quantum destabilization, which means that they actually go into a wavelength or wavelengthy type of, it's called the 0 point energy state. They go into a more of a quantum state where actually they can produce a lot of particles, for example, photons. So, and I heard in your excellent podcast that you are light and photon related research expert, and it's just I would like to give this argument to your excellent reasoning about light, that actually photons can be produced at the 0 point energy level, because protons can actually participate in quantum physics or quantum reactions in 3 different ways. One is the delocalization, which we use in MRI. The other one is this 0 point energy, which actually makes these protons to go into more like a wavelengthy or more like a quantum state. And tunneling, meaning that protons can actually bounce each other and they can actually tunnel in biochemical systems. In mitochondria, those are all very significant, especially when it comes to the research of this exclusion layer water, which definitely exists. We don't call it a force phase of water, but because of hydrophilic, hydrophobic surfaces handle water molecules differently, water structures differently around different surfaces. So that research is very important.
This is something I'll let you finish your thought if I'm interrupting, but I want to come back to Gerald Pollack's work and kind of connect some dots there.
Yeah, so I finished just very shortly. So when it comes to water in the TCA cycle, water runs the TCA cycle. We only need to drink water simply or eat food to keep the water in the mitochondria protonated. So there are extra protons there that can be processed with oxygen into water, and that kind of continues to run the TCA cycle. But practically the amount of water we lose in the form of urine or breath is probably in the 2 or 3 liter range a day. And from food, we can produce proton and hydrogen based oxygen, reduced oxygen or metabolic water, and we need to drink water as well. But that's guided by thirst. And this is why our physiology and biochemistry is just so related to this thirst, urination, sleep, hunger. These are all regulated in a very interconnected manner.
Gotcha. So maybe I'll save Dr. Pollack's work for a second. So this podcast is interesting for me because you're such a biochemistry expert, and I'm such a big picture kind of person that I let me put it this way. I have seen just so many cases where speculation based on physiological or biochemical mechanisms turns out to be just totally and completely wrong when you actually test it in a meaningful way. Like, I've seen so many theories over the years. I mean, people can say, oh, lectins do this at the molecular level, therefore all foods containing lectins are disease causing. But then when you actually look at the data, we know that foods that are rich in lectins are decidedly associated with good health. Or you can say, insulin is the main thing that makes you fat. Therefore, the only way to lose fat is to restrict carbohydrates. But then when we test equal calorie diets that are low or high carb at equal levels of calories, they cause and different levels of insulin, they result in the same exact amount of fat loss. I mean, I could give you 20 other examples of speculation based on biochemical mechanisms that just turns out to be dead wrong when you actually put it to the test in terms of real world human health outcomes.
Exactly.
So I'm genuinely fascinated with this whole topic of deuterium. I think there's some impressive research, especially around the deuterium depletion in the context of cancer treatments. However, when we're arriving at things like restricting water intake or perceiving water to be toxic, or that we need to avoid protein and carbs and eat a diet that is really like very, very unlike kind of everything we know from nutrition research and the best diets that are associated with longevity and disease prevention, for example, from the Blue Zone data, from best randomized controlled studies. In other words, you're like some of the conclusions that we're arriving at from kind of extrapolating from these deuterium related mechanisms seem very much at odds with what we know from the best nutrition data on long-term health outcomes associated with how should we eat. So, given my background with seeing so much of the mechanism-based speculation turning out to be wrong, I am wary of that being the case here as well.
We are not speculating. We are measuring deuterium levels, and we actually look at biochemical scenarios, and we are not restricting water. If you're thirsty or anybody is thirsty, they have access to water. Restricting water is practically if you don't allow anyone to drink water and hydrate their system, which is regulated by physiology. What you're talking about is excessively consuming water. That's a very different scenario.
Yeah, I agree.
And if we are not, I've never said that don't drink water if you're thirsty. I never said you don't keep water around because but what I was saying is that wait for your physiology, for your body to signal, just like for many other things. If you are sleepy, then you go to sleep. If you're thirsty, you drink water. You're not going to go to sleep in the middle of the day when you're not sleepy. Or you're not going to go to the restroom to urinate when you don't have to urinate. But for some reason, you drink water excessively even when you're not thirsty. So when you look at those studies and when you look at those arguments, those could be positioned from a different view simply because me as a biochemist, me as a physician, myself as a scientist, we go step by step. We actually look at data. We don't come up with hypotheses that are just hanging in the cloud. We actually test those hypotheses and we look at data. And when we make an interpretation, we make it available for the scientific community and for everybody for that matter just to comment and to challenge those proven hypothesis. And I hear you. Yes, there are many different, and I can give you another set of studies which fall like in the invalid scenario or invalid category. After all, we actually do test hypotheses. We actually look at data to reject or keep hypotheses. And deuterium research is actually data-based. It's actually science-based and published information, most of it, so we don't have to guess around them practically, because there are original contributions and data there, and there are papers actually show the medical positioning of deuterium in controlled clinical studies. So, and I know now the internet and interconnected ways of expressing opinions or kind of putting out some ideas without data, those will crumble simply because there's no studies, there's no hypothesis, there's no experiments, there's no experts, there's no interpretations. I'm not saying only experts should generate hypotheses, but I think hypotheses should be tested, and opinions should not be just discredited based on just some intellectual contributions. Those have to be data driven, those have to be experiment driven. And as far as deuterium testing goes, it's actually in the data scenario, it's very strong and very established.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say this is more like a guessing game. There's a lot more evidence and a lot more data to show how important deuterium depletion is. And I hope the clinical work that we are pursuing, and I've heard that you've been talking to some physicians about cancer and deuterium depletion, that's what holds. So I would not discredit deuterium simply because so many other ideas fail. I think this is here to stay.
Yeah. Gotcha. No, my intention is definitely not to discredit it. I'm just saying, like, I think as a general rule, I'm very wary of relying too much on just the biochemical mechanisms to extrapolate that out to strategies at the big picture level. You know, I've just seen so much nonsense that turns out to be wrong. I've seen people say, for example, like cortisol is terrible for you and sugar suppresses cortisol levels. Therefore, for example, in the Ray Peat method of eating, we need to consume adequate amounts of sugar to suppress cortisol because that keeps our physiology in a good state. And yet we also know from much better controlled research that consumption of refined sugar is decidedly associated with bad health. So what sounds good on a mechanism level turns out to be not so good when you put it to the test.
If you follow my media communications or social communications, I never comment and I never come out with anything that is not data driven.
Yeah.
And also I stay away from arguments that are not scientifically timely or positioned or tested or discussed well, meaning that it's really truly a process that I prefer to pursue and follow for deuterium research. The other important thing is that I'm trying to take deuterium into the standard medicine. It's in the biohacking phase right now because people would like to use it. They understand the importance of it, but that's why we do studies now, because we want to make this a mainstream medicine. We want to make this as a medicine to be able and be available at the doctor's office with very clear biochemical, translational, and clinical data and evidence-based medicine, which I do know that's one of your main missions doing this podcast, to find evidence-based medicine or evidence behind the data or the arguments that are discussed on your excellent show. And I would just like to contribute to it.
Yeah.
I just like to point out the workflow and the steps we take, not to be a guessing game anymore.
Yes. Yeah. And I thank you for the work you're doing. I think it's incredibly important.
So
I know we're a little over time, but I have a bunch more on my list, but I'll try and narrow it down to just a couple things if you have maybe 10 more minutes to spare.
Sure.
Thank you.
No problem.
So one thing that I know has come up a few times in some discussions I've been involved in is the role of molecular hydrogen and the role of the relationship of that to deuterium. And there's obviously, there's people using molecular hydrogen as a supplement or hydrogen water. I'm just curious if that has any relationship to deuterium in the body.
Yeah, so we don't know the source of the hydrogen gas that they use in this center. So I don't know. I wouldn't comment on the deuterium content. If there is excessive deuterium, because hydrogen can be oxidized into water, Um, and I don't really know what kind of deuterium content there is in
It's
water.
interesting. Your interpretation of this is different from actually what I was thinking. So you're more talking about deuterium contamination or deuterium levels in the actual hydrogen tablets. What I was referring to is like assuming it's pure hydrogen and not deuterium. What would it be doing? And how would it interact with deuterium at the cellular level?
Yeah. So if that's the question, is if it's pure hydrogen, the oxygen and hydrogen is supposed to meet in the mitochondria. And oxygen is carried in hemoglobin where one of the oxygen bonds is available. So if you hydrogenate your plasma, or you actually drink water with hydrogen, hydrogen joins oxygen very rapidly. It's called the explosive gas because it's just such a rapid, vehement reaction in chemistry. So I think hydrogen pills or hydrogen saturated water soaks up oxygen ability to deliver its function in mitochondria. That's the biochemistry argument. So that's the argument of the biochemist. If it's just pure hydrogen, then it depletes deuterium in your system, in your body. If that's the case, and I could answer this question based on data. I don't really have data, and I don't know the source of the hydrogen. If it's high in deuterium or higher in deuterium, then the water or the food that you're consuming, that is not good. If it's low in deuterium, it may have some beneficial effects, and I'm just not arguing it's not. I'm just, as a biochemist, I'm just saying that it has to be looked at from all different angles and scenarios, and certain time can be spent on it. But it's
the thought hadn't even crossed my mind about the deuterium levels in like the hydrogen tablets. That's, I mean, it's quite a thought to think. What if you're supplementing with hydrogen and really it's actually rich in deuterium?
Yeah. So what they do is they use electrolysis. They electrolyze water, or they use it from hydrogen deposits or hydrogen compartments. I don't know the source and I don't know the deuterium content, but if it's high in deuterium, and we know in the industry they use hydrogen gas for saturation processes that are high in deuterium, and that's why the products are high in deuterium. Yet with data we could answer this on a more comfortable basis, but I think after all it would be the deuterium content that would be an important topic to discuss here.
Yeah, I'm well, to anybody listening who's involved in hydrogen supplements, I would be interested to see if they could send some of those samples to your lab to test the levels of deuterium in the hydrogenated water from their supplements. Right. That would be very interesting to get those levels. So another unrelated question from a friend of mine. She was asking. She heard from her doctor that IV vitamin C. She's undergoing some treatments for melanoma right now, and she's working with some doctors who are involved in deuterium depletion. And they said something about IV vitamin C being contraindicated in the context of deuterium depletion. Do you know any, or use of deuterium depleted water or something like that? Do you know anything about that interaction?
Again, vitamin C can bind 6 protons. Right? The chemical structure of vitamin C, it's actually a proton. It's a protonating compound. So, or it can actually scavenge deuterium in mitochondria. If the source of vitamin C is a high deuterium source, then it can interfere with the deuterium depletion process in your body. If it's a natural source and it's low in deuterium, so it's not pharmaceutical based or not industry processed vitamin C, it may have a different effect. The only reason I'm not commenting on this with more details because the effect of vitamin C is so complex in the plasma, in the cell, the cytoplasm and in the mitochondria. It can actually get into the mitochondrial intermembrane space. It is actually a very complicated, very thorough process, and actually it can bind protons, and deuterium can be also a structure that binds to vitamin C. I would not give medical advice on this particular scenario, but I think after all, natural ketogenic diet with deuterium depleted water is a more safe, again, I'm not saying it's better, it's a more safe approach to address disease progression in cancer. And this is the scientist point of view. I'm a medical biochemist. I do advise based on, or I do express opinions based on medical biochemistry arguments. I'm also a professional scientist in that sense, and I'm not a clinical practitioner, but a professional practitioner, meaning that I answer questions that are research related or not settled yet. Mm-hmm. Vitamin C is not at the phase based on deuterium content and based on various other arguments, simply what's the source, what's the dose, what's the deuterium status of the patient, what kind of diet and what kind of deuterium depleting water scenarios there are. I think after all, the safest way is to drink deuterium depleted water and eat a natural ketogenic diet to address those cancer progression type of questions.
Excellent. Well, I know we're way over time here. Thank you so much for your time with me. I would love if we could wrap up this part 2 with just kind of your maybe top 2 or top 3 tips on a more practical level to help people keep their deuterium levels low. And also, if I would maybe challenge you to throw in something about Dr. Pollack's research around 4th phase water and maybe how that ties into this story.
Yeah, so again, deuterium depletion is a very important part of life. Simply that's what your body is trying to accomplish with all these biochemical reactions. Without going into details, the best way to help your body in this quest is to deplete deuterium from the outside. That includes food and water. So to be in good health, good spirit, and with good prospect, to look in the future, you want to look at deuterium always simply just to see how you can deplete it in an efficient way. Metabolic and structured and interfacial and exclusion zone water, those are very critical, very important part of research right now. And I truly admire the type of work that Dr. Pollack is doing, because simply he's looking at a certain type of water, which we don't call a 4th phase of water, what we call a structured water with different chemical and different physical chemistry. And we kind of know why the water molecules close to a surface, hydrophobic or hydrophilic surfaces, behave differently than bulk water. It has very important applications, especially in mitochondrial health. Protonated water, Zondel, and eigen-type complexes are very important of structuring water. Structuring water has, without deuterium, has very important role in proton quantum destabilization, which are very important part, we believe, of biology and cellular physiology. And just to sum it up, after all, just keep watching, because with more data we can make more thorough and more clinically feasible arguments, and this is how deuterium depletion hopefully will become standard medicine that can be obtained through doctors' orders simply because they understand these mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Boros, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for the work you're doing. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that there are many people's lives who are already being positively affected by it and will be affected by it in the future. So thank you for that work. If somebody wants to reach out to you or get their deuterium levels tested or start to learn how to deplete deuterium levels, do you do consultations like that, or do you want to, I mean, you feel free to let people know how to reach you and how to work with you and so on.
I do consultations. I do scientific consultations. I too consult with physicians and patients through physicians because I don't give advice to patients directly, but I do answer their scientific or science-related questions, and I do the same with doctors. I work for UCLA. I'm a professional scientist and in that sense, so I get many questions. If you have something to discuss about deuterium or hydrogen, you can go to the website called laszlogboros.com, and there you can see the type of services that we deliver. And if there's a clinical scenario, then I usually direct them to any one of our Dr. Schaffner or Dr. Petra Dorfsman. They are naturopathic practitioners who can actually advise patients on deuterium depleting scenarios. They are excellent colleagues and partners, and they are excellent contributors to learn about deuterium depletion in the clinical setting and the clinical scenarios. They have the positive, and they have the advantage of getting feedback from patients directly. I don't, because I don't work with patients. I depend on these great doctors, and there are many others, obviously, who I work with, but in the Los Angeles area, they are Dr. Schaffner, Dr. Dorson, they actually do work closely with us. So simply looking at the science aspects, just go to laszlogboros.com, or if you have a clinical question, you can address it to me and I will direct you to the appropriate medical practitioner. But other than that, it's a academics, scientists, and translational clinical type of complex work and information delivery service that we hope eventually will serve better health in the general population.
Beautiful. Dr. Boros, thank you again so much for coming on the show, and thank you for the work you're doing. Really a pleasure. And as I said at the end of the first show, I think you win the prize for most fascinating, most weird and interesting topic I think that's ever been discussed on this show. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.